Welcome back to the ADM+S In Conversation series, where we discuss how AI and ADM technologies are impacting our day-to-day, based on recent research by members here at the Centre. Today we're talking about AI in social services, and I'm joined by Dr Georgia van Toorn, co-author along with Professor Terry Carney on a recent article titled Decoding the Algorithmic Operations of Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme. Georgia, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, what is the NDIA or the NDIS to start?
So the NDIS is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is the Australian government's scheme for the provision of personal supports for people with disability who need support with everyday life activities and supports for community access and that sort of thing.
And so how, or I guess why, has the NDIA undergone a digital transformation of their services?
So the NDIA, which is the agency that is responsible for overseeing the scheme, has integrated a number of automated tools and computer systems into the back end of their decision-making processes. So the main system that we talk about in this article is what we call the typical support planning mechanism, which is basically the software or the platform that NDIA workers use to determine the kinds of supports that people will be funded for when they go to seek access to the scheme and have their individual support plans developed by the NDIA and funded by the NDIA.
So you just mentioned individual support plans, but how does this digital transformation kind of act as a barrier to these support plans?
Yeah, so one of the main ways in which automated and algorithmic tools are used in the NDIA or by the NDIA is in the development of individualised support plans. So when someone is deemed eligible for supports under the NDIS, they submit a whole raft of documents and other forms of information about themselves and their disability to the NDIA. And the NDIA then uses that information to construct a profile of that person based on a few data points, including the level or severity of their impairment, and also demographic factors such as their age and their geographic locations or where they live. And they use those statistical benchmarks or those data points to basically determine or create a template of supports for that person based on a sort of statistical averaging of what people with those characteristics typically need. So it's basically a form of data crunching that uses key data points to project the kinds of supports a person is likely to need based on their certain characteristics. And the problems with this approach can be that for some people that process doesn't accurately capture the nature of their disability and the way it affects them in their everyday life. The process also relies on workers, NDIA planners, being able to build on that initial sort of automatically generated template, which is called a reference package. The workers are meant to build and adjust that package of supports based on conversations that they have with NDIS participants and the sorts of preferences they have for their own support. But what we discuss in our article is that often those conversations sometimes they don't happen, sometimes they happen in ways that are quite, I guess the NDIA planner may not necessarily have the training or the time or the resources to really engage with people with disability and listen to them in terms of their own preferences for their support and what they feel they need to live a good life. So the issue is not with the computer system alone, and nor is it with the human element of the decision-making process. It's really about how the computer system and the algorithmic inputs and that process of data crunching that I just described interacts with the human and the organisational elements within the NDIA that mean that the human aspect and the accountability and the input of NDIA workers isn't always up to the standard that you would expect. It doesn't always result in the kinds of personalised outcomes that you would hope.
Which is very interesting, talking about, using words like templates and data crunching when we're sitting here talking about a system that's meant to be very personalised. To what extent is the NDIA held accountable to be transparent about these systems that they're using and how they do affect end users?
Yeah, so this is one of the big areas that we talk about in our article, which is we believe quite problematic in the sense that there are, in theory, a number of review and accountability mechanisms available to participants or people who are on the scheme. So everyone, who is in the scheme and who receives a support plan, if they're unhappy with that plan, they can seek a review of their plan via the AAT or what used to be called the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. But we find that in some cases the AAT they conduct a merits review and they can provide individual remedy in particular cases, but it doesn't address the more systemic issues of the way algorithmic inputs change the outcome of individualised support planning, sometimes in quite problematic ways.
On the topic of transparency and talking about algorithms, The article refers to algorithmic grey holes. So what do you mean by that, and what is the kind of impact of this or the solution?
So one of the key theoretical contributions that we make in this article is to argue that because of the problems that I've just described in NDIS support planning and the ways in which algorithmic inputs essentially are not considered in legal terms as decisions, it means that the whole process is actually positioned beyond the scope of effective legal review or remedy. And so to describe this scenario, we use this term, an algorithmic grey hole. So algorithmic grey holes, essentially the way they're described in the legal literature is that in a scenario where the application of algorithms by governments might be subject to certain legal limitations, as they are in Australia and in other countries, but these constraints are in effect so minimal that they permit government agencies to basically act and adopt algorithmic systems without meaningful restraint. So one of our key contributions of the article is really to illustrate how barriers to internal, so NDIA review, but also external judicial review and tribunal review mechanisms really leaves the bulk of decision making beyond the prospects of legal challenge. And we show how the excessive reliance on unknowable and opaque algorithms essentially empties legal review of its substantive merit, which transforms it, we argue, into an algorithmic grey hole.
I feel like we've talked quite a bit about kind of the downsides of implementing technology in these contexts, but I guess technology can be really helpful, right, as far as efficiency and things like this. Where do you, as someone researching in this space, see that balance of using technology to deliver services but maintaining a level of personalisation and care?
I mean, I think we have to start with questioning what are these systems being used for. Yes, these automated decision making is brought in under the pretense of making the system fairer and also more personalised, but what we see is really these assessment processes, when algorithms are involved, are often felt or experienced as just simple standardization, that people feel like the process is highly depersonalized. So I think we have to start with this question of, what are the purposes to which these ADM systems are put? Are they delivering on their promise of personalisation like they are intended to? And are we listening to people with disability? Are we listening to the people who are on the, on the receiving end of these decisions? Often it's claimed that these processes, these ADM systems can enhance, sort of make for a more personalised experience, but that's really not what is showing in the evidence when you speak to people. So when I speak to people with disability about this, they often tell me that the assessment tools that are used by the NDIA to assess their eligibility for the scheme are highly rigid. They basically consist of like a set questionnaire that asks them about their disability and the way it impacts on their everyday life. But there's a lot that's left out of those assessments. So for example, people talk about how their social relationships and their, the way in which their support is arranged around them really impacts the level of impairment that they experience, or the way their impairment impacts them in their daily life. So if they have good support arrangements, if they have a community of family or advocates around them, it might mean that they don't need as much support. But then if you talk to someone who is disadvantaged in other ways, so for example, who may have very few family around them, they might be socially isolated, they may have, in some cases had interaction with the criminal justice system, they may have just exited prison, for example. Those sorts of highly socially disadvantaged cohorts of people with disability often find that those assessments leave out crucial details about their life, which mean that their disability is not properly captured in the assessment process, and the nuance is left out. And what that often means is that their entitlement for support and the kinds of supports they receive are often a little bit off the mark, and their funding entitlement is actually underestimated or miscalculated. So I don't know if it's about the extent to which technology should be used, but the manner in which it's used. And again, I feel like perhaps there is potential for algorithms to contribute to a more personalised experience, but any ADM system that does that would need to be designed with an entirely a different set of objectives and values embedded in them. And at the moment, I feel like the people designing these systems are, government bureaucrats, people who are principally concerned with, and necessarily so, are concerned with the costs of the scheme and, putting a cap on the cost, curbing spending on the scheme, and not necessarily delivering, personalisation for people. And I think if that's really going to be our aim, we need to be asking people with disability how to achieve that, and be open, genuinely open to the answer that perhaps technology at the moment cannot deliver on that that particular goal of personalising support planning. I think for me, ADM systems may have a role, but what's really needed is a system in which those sorts of tools are embedded in a culture and in an organisational environment where human expertise is respected, where the human decision-making element, there's not just a human decision-making element, but it's a meaningful one, and that those NDIA workers are sufficiently trained and sufficiently resourced to be able to engage people with disability and facilitate their own meaningful involvement in decision-making, not just, as an afterthought or as an optional extra.
It's been really fascinating hearing about this use of ADM technologies and learning about the impacts of this kind of digital transformation on workers of the NDIA and end users acts as a reminder of just how integrated these systems are in our daily lives. So Georgia, thank you so much for taking part in this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.